I need to issue a non-ironic warning before you proceed watching this video and deciding that any part of what I have to say is worth your time, worth your attention. If you are having a particularly hard time appreciating the value of certain human suffering in any and all forms for some sufficient purpose, you are going to have a hard time with this video. You might even have a hard time with me. I am a person of faith, so naturally I'm going to try to make appreciable certain sympathy to what some might call religiosity. But this story honestly was really distressing to my own personal framework of beliefs. Not for anything, distinctly disturbing, as I have outlined in my previous character autopsies. Please feel free to catch up on those after this one, because you're already sat, you're already comfortable, we're already warming up your snack. You can't leave now, okay? But for how difficult it is to reconcile vested saintliness, not just with natural human error, not just with, the normal struggle to be perfect. And I'm sure we all have grace for that. I mean, I certainly do. But for how difficult it is to reconcile with aggressive insincerity. The problem I see with legacies, driven more by personal dogma than any real genuine compassion for human beings, isn't any fault with the dogma itself, right? This video isn't a picking apart of Catholicism as a religion, as a dogma. This video is a disclaimer, it's not that, it is not what I'm here to do. It's even worse. This video is a picking apart of a person. It is a picking apart of character. Again, I can entirely appreciate that probably makes it a lot worse, but my issue is this. Abstract entities of faith and creed cannot defend themselves, not reliably at least. But individual entities of their persuasion can, and let's be honest, they are answerable to every dishonesty. So by my tone, I'm sure it is too obvious what slant of bias you are exposing yourself to. Know, again, for transparency's sake, that I do have a very specific soft spot for religious sympathies. I will, as I tell you the story, afford the benefit of the doubt until I absolutely can't. I genuinely do believe that my approach in this sense will allow you to appreciate when things truly do become inexcusable. I am so curious to see where this lands, how this lands, but without further ado, we don't like to waste any time here, so let's begin. Alright, so the context of one's most psychologically malleable years will always be my first point of address when telling you a story. And so I won't begin by regurgitating to you date and year of birth for the sake of forcing you through a biography. I'm not here to bore you. It's just not what we're here to do. That tells you very little. So instead, I want you to familiarize yourself with a region part of the Ottoman Empire known today as modern-day Macedonia. We are looking here at a juvenescence informed by devout Roman Catholicism. We're looking at parents who instill within you a reverence for doctrine that emphasizes the value of suffering, particularly a spiritual value for pain, for suffering, sacrifice, and poverty. Effectively, the kind of thing that no one willfully, beckons into their life experience. We all try to naturally avoid, because I think we all can appreciate that something does feel quite wrong about unnecessary straining in life. Her father was this successful entrepreneur who was a committed Albanian nationalist. He was also very much involved in politics. And so when I say that the family lived modestly, I mean that in the most modest sense of the word. They weren't rich, they weren't terribly poor, they were comfortable, But then again, with every trajectory of seeming stability, something always seems to be looming in the corner, and it agitates those foundations. And that is what unfortunately happened with her family. So when she's 8 years old, her father dies of what is suspected to be poisoning. And so we know that politics is a very dirty, it is a very dangerous game. It is unsympathetic to your faith, it is unsympathetic to your innocent dependence, and it is unsympathetic to the colossal reverberation of your loss. Now, at this point in our story, we see a young girl introduced to the immediate weight of financial insecurity. We see her introduced to the practical efforts of a selfless lifestyle as informed by religious dogma, and we see this really exampled with her mother. Her mother, effectively, after her father's death, becomes the primary breadwinner. Her mother runs, the small embroidery textile business, and despite the challenges, she remains deeply committed to charity. She gives food to the less fortunate, and her daughter unquestionably remains so devout to her faith. She attends mass daily, not just on Sundays, but daily. So she's really committed to this. And her faith, despite certain anxiety following her father's absence, and of course, the fact that Roman Catholics were in the minority in a predominantly Orthodox Christian and Muslim society, hardens over the years. Her faith hardens over the years. And so by the age of 12, you guys, she's already expressed a deep desire to live a life of religious service. She was inspired by the stories of missionaries in her church, specifically missionaries in India. And so by the time she turns 18, she moves and she joins the Sisters of Loretto, which is an Irish community of nuns with specific missions localized to India. This is where she adopts the name Teresa, and so she leaves behind her family, she moves to Ireland, she learns the language of instruction, which is English. In 1929, our protagonist sets sail for Calcutta, and so at this point, I'm going to expedite the fluff in this narrative because unlike her, we don't have 20 years to appreciate the maturation of a belief system. So yes, after this, around 20 years are spent teaching affluent families, specifically girls in Calcutta. For this duration of time, she lives in a convent with, relatively comfortable conditions despite her vows of poverty. Now, we cannot obviously take away those vows from her as a Catholic, but this specific period of her life was indeed marked by stability and security offered by the Loretto convent. Excuse, of course, for the temporary volatility provided by her father's death. By this point, she spent a good 25-ish years somewhat removed from the extreme poverty she later becomes associated with. And so I don't point this out for nothing. I highlight this fact not because I'm particularly, upset about it, but I highlight this fact because it is extreme poverty that becomes part of Mother Teresa's brand of saintlihood. In Calcutta, she was exposed to an environment teeming with the homeless, the sick, the dying, and like any person with a heart, a soul, she was obviously sympathetic to certain human suffering. But she was most definitely not a part of it, and there's nothing wrong with that. That is completely fine, but we'll see how this informs her later convictions in this narrative. We see how this informs the organization that was Mother Teresa's legacy, but most crucially, we see how this informs where things become inexcusably messy. In 1950, Mother Teresa officially founds the Missionaries of Charity, which is an order dedicated to serving the most destitute people of Calcutta. The order was formed by several principles, but what you need to appreciate for the context of this narrative is the most fundamental one. Her nuns were expected to live in extreme poverty, foregoing material comforts, to better understand the strenuous lives of those they served. Because the most unadulterated form of empathy is experience, right? Putting on the shoes of those you are serving so that you can walk with them in their suffering. Sure, anyway, we'll pick that apart later. The order's basic mission was to provide care for the orphans, the hopeless, the lepers, the dying, and so by establishing the Missionaries of Charity, Mother Teresa committed herself and her adjacent followers to a lifestyle of extreme simplicity, not lack, not extreme abundance, but just basic simplicity. Put a pin in that. You need to understand that her primary focus was not in alleviating the root causes of poverty, addressing any systemic aggressors to its anguish, but in instilling certain acquiescence, coming into certain agreement with an unfairness that you cannot help. And in this section, we are teetering on the beginnings of the most controversial parts of her legacy. Poverty, by Mother Teresa's philosophy, is a form of purity. And so the less access to abundance you have, the less excess can quite literally access you and distract you from the world that most people can't see, the spiritual world. If we have material priorities, we obviously have spiritual priorities. And an overexposure to material stress means that we inevitably will neglect our souls. You cannot afford to neglect your soul. And the basic idea undergirding the sentiment is that there is an eternal consequence to neglecting your soul, to refusing vehemently to know your God, the creator of your soul. This particular philosophy extended poverty to all generalized pain. And so you cannot deny the fact that so many people are broken specifically to the end of themselves and the beginning of their faith by certain pain. But does God truly want you to break indefinitely in order for you to eventually realize him? Is he quite literally forcing his hand on your will such that enough anguish will wrench you out of self-prioritizing godless delusion? Don't answer that yet. I know you're tempted to, but we'll get back there. It's very tempting, I know, but this so quickly bleeds into one's subjective moral framework. So that is why I'm just saying, set it aside for now. We will return later. The point is, at this point in time, her organization is growing. And the strangely consistent thing about human nature, even back then, is that bad people always want to be made adjacent to good things, to good movements. That makes Mother Teresa's organization a target. And so she's getting donations from very, very powerful people of diverse complexions of good, morally gray, bad, utterly contemptible, but more so on the latter end of that spectrum. And so my personal angle to rationalizing this, why this came to be, is that when you believe that you can just absorb your moral evils by stuffing money and resources towards an objectively good moral effort, the understanding that the delusion that you subject yourself to is that it is a lot easier to make justifiable what small evil you have committed, because that small evil looks laughable in comparison to the colossal contribution of your good. The list, trust me, is long. The bad people are many, so I'm just going to name a few. For example, Charles Keating. Charles Keating is quite the character. He's a convicted fraudster. Well, he is the convicted fraudster behind the savings and loan scandal, which cost US taxpayers $3.4 billion. Now, despite being informed of Keating's criminal activity, Mother Teresa refused to return the donations. She refused to condemn his actions, and instead she wrote a letter during the trial on his behalf to consider Keating's donations as evidence of his goodwill. And then we have the oppressive elite, and why is she maintained such strange familiarity with them? She received large donations from the dictator of Haiti, and she even visited his family, praising their generosity. She built several relationships with a lot of controversial political figures, including Indira Gandhi, during India's emergency period, which essentially was a period where civil liberties were severely and brutally oppressed. And I mean that in the most cruel, the most inhumane, and the most inexcusable sense of the word. Indians suffered under this period. We even have Robert Maxwell, for goodness sakes, who was this huge British media tycoon who essentially just owned a large number of newspapers, including the Daily Mirror. Anyway, he was later discovered to have stolen hundreds of millions of pounds from his company's pension fund. This left thousands of employees without their retirement benefits. And you should just really appreciate the scale of the scandal, like how bad it was. What I'm describing to you is one of the largest corporate thefts in UK history. Maxwell made incredibly large donations to Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity, and she reportedly accepted all of these funds without any consideration to their origins or the harm obviously caused to these families, to these victims. Then we have Enver, the dictator of Albania. He effectively ruled from 1944 to 1985. He established a Stalinist dictatorship in Albania, which is Mother Teresa's ethnic country of origin. He effectively transformed Albania into one of the most isolated, one of the most repressive countries in Europe. Now, Mother Teresa, as an Albanian herself, expressed certain nationalistic pride for Albania, but don't get it twisted, she never publicly condemned the oppressive regime or the suffering he caused. She also refused to speak out against the severe religious persecution in her own country, against people of her own faith. She was also unsurprisingly silent on many other issues of social justice, including India's deeply entrenched caste system. I guess what I'm trying to say is that despite being someone who, talked so much about caring so much, she was mum on every related humanitarian issue, every related humanitarian injustice committed by her benefactors. Which, to me, fine. You don't have to get political if you don't want to, but the issue is, these weren't morally grey characters. These were active perpetrators of human suffering. Now, speaking of suffering, we're going to return to some of the strings that I left hanging previously. We're gonna tie them up right now. The conditions in Mother Teresa's care homes are one of the most troubling, one of the most distressing aspects of her legacy. They have been described by volunteers, particularly her home for the dying in Kolkata, as neglectful, as cruel, and more akin to homes for the dying rather than homes for care. So, you ask me, and validly so, Catherine, how bad was it? Well, patients were often denied painkillers and antibiotics, even for excruciating conditions like cancer. Medical professionals who volunteered at these homes reported some truly disturbing conditions. Reused needles, unhygienic facilities, and poor access to proper medical treatment. Not luxury medical treatment, not modest medical treatment, but basic bare minimum treatment. They were refused. Remember, Mother Teresa's philosophy is that suffering is necessary, it is redemptive, it is purifying to the human spirit. And so for her, I can understand that she was probably thinking that there is something illegal about not accepting your lot in life. Despite her organization's, by this point, considerable financial resources, financial records, by the way, that she refused to disclose, Mother Teresa vehemently refused to improve these conditions. She even sent terminal patients to die in other hospitals rather than receive any type of proper care in her own hospices. I will read you some parts of her explication for these particular convictions. I think it is very beautiful for the poor to accept their lot, to share it with the passion of Christ. I think the world is being much helped by the suffering of poor people. Suffering is nothing by itself, but suffering shared with the passion of Christ Christ, it is a wonderful gift, the most beautiful gift, a token of love. So you would think, I would genuinely think that a belief so genuine would be extended into her own personal experience of suffering. I don't think it's too far out of the water to assume that, right? Because to me, the logic is that when someone truly understands the eternal value of an idea, they integrate it into their own lived experience as evidence of the value for that particular idea. Now, I hate to disappoint you, but as the story goes, when Mother Teresa fell ill, she was flown out to state-of-the-art hospitals in Europe and the United States, such as the Scripps Clinic in California. Mother Teresa lived in relatively comfortable quarters within her own convent, and though obviously modest compared to the egregiously wealthy elite, she wasn't suffering. She wasn't living in the adjacent squalor suffered by her staff and by her patients next door. Even when she had every financial resource to alleviate certain suffering, she said no. It wasn't a matter of naive neglect to alleviate certain pain, to alleviate certain suffering. It was a blatant refusal. I repeat, for those of you in the back who need to appreciate this, she was asked on multiple occasions, and she said no. A blatant, unapologetic refusal. People died in those homes, according to reports, without basic dignity. I need that to really sit with you. I need you to really appreciate the gravity of what this was. It was also reported by volunteers and staff that Mother Teresa instructed her nuns to baptize patients who were near death, rather to secretly baptize them regardless of their religious beliefs. These baptisms were said to be performed by quietly putting on a wet cloth on the dying patient's forehead and then quietly murmuring the baptismal rites as the patient died. They were allegedly carried out on Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and other non-Christians with the justification that it would help them receive salvation in the Christian faith. Now, I should seriously note that not all Christians believe this. The principle is particularly prevalent in Catholicism, which is why christening is so necessary in certain sects and rejected in other sects. The latter is my personal conviction, and I just feel it important to make that transparent to you, even as I narrate the latter ends of this story. According to sources, nuns were instructed to ask the dying patient if they wanted, quote, a ticket to heaven, and so after the patient expressed confusion or somewhat affirmed, they would perform the rites, the baptismal rites, and they allowed the patient to die. In cases where the patients were too ill to respond or just unconscious, the nuns would baptize these patients without their knowledge, without their consent. And the reason this idea in particular, is rejected in so many sects of Christianity is because of a rejection of the idea that you can secure your way by some combination of religious actions into heaven. Now, if, as a person of faith, you cannot appreciate how spiritually manipulative these actions are, I honestly don't know what to tell you. A person who quote-unquote converts, not fully capable of being able to apprehend the scope of what it is that they are consenting to be a part of, at least to me, they have not converted. Genuine belief just cannot be artificially compelled out of you. Whether you believe in God or not, whether you believe yourself religious or not, you're going to have to come to a point where you reconcile with the point of purposeless suffering. You're going to have to reconcile with whether or not you want to be a part of the plight suffered by others. And I completely appreciate that some people just don't. They want nothing to do with other people's pain. It's not me, but I understand that it exists. There are people born to live seconds of pain only to die. There are people born who will only know moments and years of anguish only to die. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have the emotional and financial capacity to care about everyone with certain pain when I simply don't. I'm not going to pretend to be a saint. I'm not going to pretend to be an empath when I'm not. But I am grateful for the fact that when my heart actually breaks, it breaks all the way through. And I can appreciate the frustration with certain religiosity in being told to endure for an end that you don't even believe in. What's funny is that I genuinely don't think it's a frustration with religiosity per se. I think it's a frustration with hypocrisy, and that bleeds everywhere. It bleeds everywhere where people claim to have the moral high ground, religious or not. And trust me, I can appreciate the frustration of just being burnt out. The politics of saintly ideas when all you know is how to feel tired. All you know is how to feel sad. And maybe your pain isn't in a war zone somewhere. It is paralyzing and it hurts, and it's yours. But we also need to appreciate, I think, that it doesn't take a lot to build an honest legacy. It really doesn't. It just requires you not to lie. It just requires you to care about the things you actually say that you care about. Because when your hypocrisy as a saint runs unchecked, it destroys people. Thank you so much for listening today. I will see you next time, but you please take care. I will see you very soon.